Good afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon special symposium on the impacts of woodland encroachment. This afternoon we're going to focus our efforts more on the benefits of these treatments to wildlife, and in particular focusing in on two grouse species, the greater sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken, and other obligate species to those systems. I'm Christian Hagan, associate professor at Oregon State University. I'm in the senior research. I oversee a couple grad students there, and I also am heavily involved in lesser prairie chicken conservation in the Midwest. And I will be moderating this session. Our first speaker to kick us off is Rick Miller, who is a professor emeritus at the Range Science School at Oregon State University in Corvallis, where he was there for 41 years. Rick?
Right, thank you, Christian, and see a few faces out there. I'm hoping we'll get more people to wander in as lunchtime. I know they're still stuck there at lunch. I'm going to be kind of recapping just a few highlights of the presentations to come, but kind of also talk just a little bit about some of the issues. And you know, a lot of us right here might think, well, we're here because of grouse, but we really aren't. Grouse aren't the problem. It's the ecosystem that's in real trouble. And so this both sagebrush ecosystem and the grassland ecosystems are ones where we're seeing a considerable amount of fragmentation and degradation and loss. And for that reason is one of the reasons why we're here. I'm going to be kind of covering both, but you'll notice I've got a real bias to the sagebrush system because I haven't spent very much time on the east side of the Rockies. But Sam, who will follow me up, will be kind of leaning on the other side, so we'll kind of balance each other out here. Of course, there's a lot of perturbations and issues that have been going on in both systems and in the prairies. You know, they're very similar, but probably cultivation is more of an issue in the prairies than it is over in the sagebrush. But we both have issues with conifers moving in the case of mesquite, and just loss of habitat. And it's the same with over in the Intermountain region, but we have a much larger problem with invasive species. But we also have then, of course, the conifers, and you know, you have urbanization in both systems, development. We have problems with large wildfires, but then Sam just told me they had one, 400,000 acres. So they're starting to catch up. They must be coming over here and studying how do we have these gigantic wildfires. And so, you know, maybe there's some hope for the east side. The other thing, and I know Sam will be talking about quite a bit of this, is the issues with connectivity and fragmentation of these systems and what that means, particularly from a management standpoint. So what we'll be talking about today, and what I'll be talking about today, is kind of these two regions of the Intermountain Great Basin sagebrush ecosystems and the shortgrass prairie shortgrass ecosystems, and really looking at conifer and mesquite encroachment. And you might say, well, you know, with all these other things going on, why are we spending so much time and energy and dollars focusing on this encroachment? And one of the main reasons, I believe, is because many of these systems still have all the components there. Not all of them, but a lot of them still have those components there. So there's still a pretty good amount of resilience to where we can go in and remove the conifers or the mesquite, and we still have maybe, particularly if we go in the early phases, we still have a shrub component or a grass component. So we have a high degree of success if we select our sites right. Now, there's no doubt we can hit areas that have already crossed the threshold, or we know in the Intermountain region, these particularly dry, warm, big sagebrush sites are really tough. We can go out there and treat them and we can seed them, but our rates of success are not very high, particularly when we get into areas with less than 10 inches. So in a way, we're kind of hitting these areas where we have a pretty good chance of success. What's interesting is I think the first standalone symposium that I'm aware of was presented in Logan in 1975, and they covered a lot of the ecology and vegetation management of to the date that they knew, and there was also a section on wildlife. And Terrell and Spillett were the guys that presented the wildlife component, and their kind of conclusions were, well, what they found was there was considerable amount of information, at least 95% of the information on wildlife in relation to PJ and treatment related to deer winter range. And most at that time, the bulk of the treatments were chaining. In fact, in 1967, over 500,000 acres were chained in the Intermountain West. That was the peak year. 50% of those acres were chained in the state of Utah. So chaining, this of course the big area here that you're looking at was cut, but chaining was a big factor. But their conclusions for wildlife overall, and this is not my statement, but this is theirs, that saying we sit on the most extreme state of ignorance in terms of what is the impact on all wildlife species. So this was in 1975. So I kind of imagine this graduate student raising their hand in the back of the room saying, well, you know, don't worry, because in 4 decades, grouse is going to be driving PJ management. I mean, it's just, what a turnaround. I mean, they would have laughed that student just right out. So since 75, I think we've gained quite a bit more information on how these systems function in the process and looking at resilience. And we've got some really good tools. We've got a lot more information on soils. We have a lot more soil mapping. We've got ecological site characteristics that help us really base on what characteristics are going to, how are those going to affect any kind of management that we may want to do. And where are we tipping thresholds or going into a new steady state in how these mesquite encroachment, or particularly, say, PJ, will influence to where suddenly we've lost that point. If we remove, we've got to do other treatments. And we also know that with encroachment, there's a dramatic change in structure and habitat and composition, and also growing season. John Bates had some of the early work on seasonal moisture, and Bruce Roundy's really contribute a lot to that in terms of you really shorten down the growing season for available, say, forbs during these systems. So it does have an impact in terms of what's available, how long it's available, and the structure. And in a worst case scenario, we know that we can have, and depending a lot on the kind of site that it is, we can actually definitely go into a total new steady state that we're unlikely to be able to return because we've lost the A horizon. And I know Fred Pearson and Jason Williams and their group there at the Watershed Lab have done a lot of work in the Great Basin. And Jason later is going to talk a little bit more about how conifers can influence snow retention and snow release. So there's a lot of things that sometimes we don't think about that changes in conifer expansion can really have an impact on function of these ecosystems. So this special symposium is kind of based on is based on the special issue that just came out in 2016 on looking at this encroachment issues with grouse. And I think there's really some good information in this. There's some of these things we've known, but there's some really new things that we thought we knew, but we really couldn't back up with information. I think we had a pretty good handle on, as these conifers or mesquite expand, that we would see grouse kind of move back, and we would either see them at all or we'd see a lot fewer birds. We really didn't know exactly how does it influence their behavior or mortality or the capacity or density of how much, as we get conifers across, does it really impact numbers. And the big question was, well, if we treat these areas, will they return? Well, and our answer just not long ago was, well, we think so, but we don't really have anything to back that up. So just to kind of highlight a couple of things here is that when we think about reduced capacity or when the birds start to avoid, Mark Freese, in a project that really was looking at other things kind of as a sidelight, Steve Peterson was good GIS, and he kind of decided, well, let's take a look. And, is there kind of, at what point do we see where we suddenly see the birds really obviously not using areas? And Mark came up with about 5% tree cover was kind of the break. And then since then, Brock Mercado and Severson have come up with a lot more refined and more intense studies that have really looked at this, and they've kind of brought it down more to about 4%. So you get about 4% trees, the birds really start to avoid. And I know Mike Gregg had a great data set of about 10 years of nesting distribution on Hart Mountain, and you could look at nest distribution out there, And boy, where you had passes of juniper, it was these big gaps where the birds were not definitely nesting in these open stands. Well, if we bring that over to the prairie country, that they are finding avoidance was about 15% or more, where suddenly birds are dropping out. But when it came to nesting, the birds were avoiding areas that had 2% or more tree cover. So obviously, again, we're looking at they're avoiding these areas. Some of the latest work by Koska and I know Peter Coates and group have been working on, and you'll hear from these guys, that it does affect their movement and mortality. And they're finding that as birds are moving through these woodland stands, that particularly for the juveniles, they'll see an increased rate of mortality. The birds move faster than they'll move through, when they're moving through juniper, than they will through sagebrush, and it does have an effect, again, particularly on mortality. And I thought the interesting component, and again, these guys are going to go into a lot more detail, is ecological traps. That you can have pretty wide open stands such as this, and this is one the NRCS went in combination and treated, but you get these open stands and actually the birds they'll be more casual moving through them, but there's a higher amount of predation, probably again because you have raptors perching in these trees. So the big question is, will they return? And the answer to that is, at least in the sagebrush system that they found, within 3 years, the females were not only returning, but they were seeing an increase in nest success. I think the key thing here is, though, and that I know Sam will talk, even though he'll be more in the prairie country, a lot of the principles he's going to be talking about apply just as well when you talk about fragmentation. And so, you might see an area thinking, well, if we cut trees here and we create great habitat for grouse, they'll come. But a lot of that depends on how does that little piece on the landscape fit with everything else and where the populations are using. And I believe for most of these, it's if you cut areas that are adjacent to where birds already are, you're going to get a lot more movement of birds into those adjacent areas, and they will start using those. Will they return in the prairie country? That I think they're assuming they will, but again, we really don't know. I double-checked with Sam before I stuck my neck out on that, and he said, well, we don't really have the hard numbers yet, but I think we'll probably start seeing those pretty soon. The other thing that's besides the bird, the grouse, we're seeing other sagebrush obligate species coming in, and I'm sure in the prairie country they're seeing increased grassland birds coming in also. I know Oklahoma, the other OSU, I've done some pretty good bird work on looking at burns and how bird populations change with different management practices in the prairie country. Falkowski, who gave a great presentation yesterday, also is providing some great tools to not only map out, for example, different community types, but in this case juniper, but also the density of juniper, which enables us to really get a feel for landscape scales of where maybe some of the problems are, and you can zoom in here where the problems are and where we might want to best do our treatments. And again, this is all in that 2016 special issue. So kind of to wrap it up a little bit here is that something that really sticks to me, because I always get a little nervous about umbrella species, and probably be time Christian can probably fill this in, but I always get nervous when we start talking about single species and management and umbrella species. And Benson in 212 came up with this statement that I thought was a good one, where he talks about, first and foremost, there's a need to shift management strategies that are centered on species and really look at it more from a systems base, which I think is real important from an ecosystem function standpoint. But here's another reason why it's really important to do that, is Duvall, in this special issue, who was doing more of the social end, found that when they had these working groups, if you went from single species focus to suddenly, okay, where it's more of an ecosystem focus, you suddenly had buy-in from the multiple stakeholders, particularly the private landowners. The private landowners were having a hard time, just saying we got to do all this stuff to focus on a single species or a bird, but when you start talking about ecosystem function and resilience and health, they're saying, hey, okay, we can buy into that. We're a lot more interested. So that's a real key. And another important component that Sam is going to, I'm telling Sam what he's going to be talking about. He didn't know any of this yet. That really you've got to focus on not the micromanagement. It's so easy to look at a site saying, well, you know, this is a good site we can treat and good things will happen. But we need to look at, well, how does that fit in with the whole landscape? And are there other places that from a landscape perspective in a large scale that we really might want to be looking at? And so I really feel from my own personal standpoint, I think that this grouse is concern with grouse and the money coming in is a great opportunity in terms of it's such a large scale, covering such a large area, and at least at this time we have some really good resources to deal with this, but we can use this as an opportunity to really get after restoring ecosystem function that will benefit a lot of species and a lot of processes, including the water cycle and these other things. So that's all I had. Any questions? And if not, I know, Christian, do you want to add anything to the umbrella species thing? Christian's, I'm a range guy. Christian's a wildlife guy. We'll see how much we agree here.
Great, and I guess I think part of the larger discussion and what this special issue, this recent special issue in REM is all about is, can we use these umbrella species as a rallying point to deliver these larger ecosystem services? From the wildlife side, we think that it is a real opportunity and a real possibility, especially with prairie chickens and sage grouse that do require this heterogeneous landscape, both in both time and space. So I guess it's really, we're looking to you all for your feedback and broadening that conversation as we move forward. So great. Thanks, Rick.